Translator's Exegesis by Zoe Womack. The text I've chosen is Oral History, Game Design and Marketing of Space Invaders by Fukuda et al. The source language is Japanese, but it also has an official title in English, as you see on this slide. It's a transcription of an interview with Tomohiro Nishikado, the creator of Space Invaders. As the title suggests, it's about the development and marketing of this popular arcade game. Looking at this diagram of Reese's text types and varieties, I believe that my chosen text is most similar to a documentary or biography. Just like a biography, it provides information about the subject, while also partly performing the expressive function of a piece of literature. It may even have an operative function in convincing the reader of the correctness or error of the subject's actions. So it's a hybrid of all three text types: informative, expressive, and operative. As a hybrid of all three text types, the purpose of my chosen text is to entertain, to educate readers about the development and marketing of the game, and possibly to convince them that the creators of the game made good decisions. The target audience is likely to be fans of the game and its development, and possibly also people who are doing research to develop and market their own game. I chose this text because I'm interested in games and want to specialize in translating creative texts like literature, games, and marketing. But I know that these kinds of texts require a lot more transcreation, which machine translation is not capable of. My text was a good compromise as it talks about the topics I'm interested in, but in a format that is more suitable for machine translation. The text is in the form of a dialogue, with all sentences written in a conversational style, but with most of the filler words, such as and omitted. The interviewer speaks in a very polite, formal register, and Mr. Nishikado speaks in a casual register. This is reflective of Japanese culture, where social hierarchy is of utmost importance. I may attempt to reflect this in the translation, but will likely tone it down a little for the target culture. Here is a quote that is quite famous in translation studies. Either the translator leaves the writer in peace as much as possible and moves the reader towards him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer towards him. The choice of whether to be source or target-oriented is influenced by the text type, the target audience, and the translation purpose. As I said before, my text type is similar to a biography or a documentary, and Monday suggests that a documentary translation will be more source culture-oriented. I believe that this is likely due to the translation purpose, which is to educate the target audience about the source culture, or at least an aspect of it. So I plan to take more of a source-oriented approach in my translation. So what kind of equivalent should I aim for? NIDA suggests two types of equivalence: formal and dynamic. Formal equivalence focuses attention on the message itself in both form and content. In this kind of translation, the message in the receptor culture is constantly compared with the message in the source culture to determine standards of accuracy and correctness. Dynamic equivalence, on the other hand, aims at complete naturalness of expression and tries to relate the receptor to modes of behavior relevant within the context of his own culture. As I've said, the purpose of my text is to educate, and I plan to take a more source-oriented approach, so aiming for formal equivalence is more appropriate. The translation theorists Vigne and Darbonnet suggest 7 types of translation strategies: borrowing, calque, literal translation, transposition, modulation, equivalence, and adaptation. The strategies that I anticipate making use of are borrowing, transposition, modulation, and equivalence. I may possibly also use calques if a word in the source text calls for it. I do not plan on using literal translation as a strategy. Literal translation is more frequently used between languages with common ancestry than between unrelated languages such as Japanese and English. Since their grammatical structures are so different, overly close correspondence to the syntax of the source language can seriously impair the effectiveness of communication in the target language and can even come out sounding ridiculous. I also do not plan on making much use of domestication strategies. The purpose of my text is to educate, and my target audience are fans of the game who are probably at least a little interested in Japanese culture. It may also be important to understand the cultural context when it comes to the marketing of the game. So I do not plan to use more target-oriented techniques such as adaptation, which is swapping out culture-specific concepts for something more familiar in the target culture. One exception I may make, however, is turning down the level of formality in the interviewer's register in order to make the text more enjoyable for the target audience. Transposition, or the rendering of certain parts of speech as other parts of speech, such as translating a nominal construction as a verbal one, is a strategy that I will likely use a lot, as, generally speaking, Japanese sentences are driven by verbs, whereas English writers tend to favor noun-based structures. So even though transferring verb-based structures into English is quite possible, it might not produce the most natural outcome. It's also not necessary in Japanese to explicitly state the subject of a sentence or specify whether something is plural or singular, so the translator is often required to look for context cues, or even just guess. Transposing a verb-based construction with a noun-based one could be a good strategy here. Translation using a verb-based construction in English, which requires an explicit subject, might necessitate insertion of a pronoun or a name, which introduces a personal tone and an air of subjectivity that can be inappropriate at times. Noun-based constructions avoid this, and they are often more succinct. Another useful strategy for Japanese English translation is modulation, i.e., changing the point of view of the message. By changing the active voice to passive, for example, the need to specify an unknown subject can be avoided. Japanese also tends to use passive voice in situations where English doesn't, such as to show respect or to indicate an adverse situation. For example, I was died on by my father in Japanese. These kinds of unnatural utterances in English should be modulated by changing the passive voice to active in order to be more suitable and idiomatic in the target language. According to Vinay and Darbonnet, modulation is justified when a literal or transposed translation is unsuitable, unidiomatic, or awkward in the target language, despite possibly being grammatically correct. There tend to be many sentences like this when translating between English and Japanese, so I anticipate using modulation a lot. As Baker says, the idea is not to replace an active form with an active one, and a passive form with a passive one. It is always the function of the category rather than the form it takes that is of paramount importance in translation. So using a different grammatical structure to the source text may be a useful strategy to effectively translate the content, intent, and sense of the text, while ensuring a smooth and idiomatic translation in the target language. Equivalence and borrowing are also useful strategies. Equivalence involves replacing set expressions and idioms with their functional or semantic equivalents in the target language. This is particularly useful since English and Japanese are both languages that use a lot of idioms, many of which are culturally unique. Borrowing culture-specific terms is another strategy that I'm likely to use, since I plan to take a source-oriented approach in my translation. Following the loan word with an explanation is very useful when the word in question is repeated several times in the text. Once explained, the loan word can then be used on its own. The reader can understand it and is not distracted by further lengthy explanation. While post-editing the translation of my text, I plan to make use of Mosop's revision parameters to assist me in evaluating the machine translation output. In particular, I will refer to his parameters relating to transfer, content, and language. The highlighted sections here are of particular importance when post-editing. These are questions I can ask myself when deciding if something is actually an error or whether amendments are truly necessary. That's all. Here's my bibliography. Thank you for listening.